Good day everyone. I am Kate J. Villegas and my partner is Mark Erin D. Garcia and our thesis advisor is Ma'am Lynette D. Santos from the School of Chemical, Biological, and Materials Engineering and Science. We will be presenting our thesis entitled Assessment of Manganese Concentration in Limay Shoreline Sediments via Atomic Absorption Spectrometry, a monitoring approach. This will be the overview of our presentation. As shown, the first section will discuss the introduction, the second part will contain the methodology, and the third section will contain the results and discussion, and lastly, the conclusion. Manganese compounds increase due to runoffs, lack of waste management in residences, and industrial activities, especially in oil and gas and mining. Thus, the manganese accumulates in areas surrounded by these facilities. Since manganese spread in bodies of water through contamination, and considering the industries and residences in Limay Bataan, thus it is also as expected that the bodies of water in Limay are also exposed to manganese contamination. This research is limited to sediment samples that will be acquired on the shoreline of Limay only. The main objective is to conduct a study about the presence of manganese along the shorelines of Limay using atomic absorption spectrometry. The importance of monitoring sediments will benefit in leading a proper management system that improves the water system in the mine. Additionally, it is also expected that this study will contribute to identifying contaminated areas and possible causes of heavy metal exposure to restrain the further spread of heavy metal and manage and conserve the water system in Limay.
In our methodology focusing on research local, the scope of our research will be in Limay, Bataan. Limay is a vast municipality composed of 12 barangays which includes Reformista, Alangan, Kitang, Barilus, Lamao, and etc. And it also has a 7-kilometer shoreline. Our sample sites will be on the shorelines of Limay, specifically in Barilus and Lamao, which are close to the residences.
We base our first sampling near the town of Limay and the small and big industries, and we use the Google Maps to locate the exact location of the sampling sites.
So as for our second sampling site, located in Lamao as presented in figure number 3, we chose this sampling site since it is near a sewage area in the residences of Lamao. Lamao is approximately located at a latitude of 14 degrees and 31 minutes north and a longitude of approximately 120 degrees and 36 minutes east.
The scientific research aims to gather concrete results by measuring the manganese concentration in the sediment samples. The sediment samples were sent to the First Analytical Service and Technical Cooperative Laboratories or FASLab, where the chemists utilized the Pinnacle 900F to examine the concentration of heavy metals in the sediment samples. A preliminary test of different heavy metals including nickel, copper, lead, and manganese was conducted on July 2, 2023 in order to determine the heavy metal on the shoreline of Limay. After the preliminary testing, the manganese concentration testing was gathered on a weekly basis from August 6, 2023 to September 10, 2023 with a total of 12 samples. The sediment samples will be gathered from the Limay shoreline using a clean scoop and put it inside a sealed container. The collection process was done in the morning around 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. every week for 1.5 months. Hence, there will be a total of 12 samples that will be coming from two sampling sites. Then, the samples will be placed in a storage box since they will be shipped from Bataan to FAST laboratories to prevent the contamination and preserve the samples. For the first test, there will be a preliminary sample that took 2 weeks to acquire the data for manganese concentration, followed by the testing of the other sediment samples. The sediment samples that were collected will be ground to a consistent particle size after being dried. After that, the sediment samples will be put through a sieve to obtain the desired size for the metal analysis. Next, the sediment samples will be weighed into a beaker, and the sediment samples will then be digested until the volume is reduced. In order to determine the concentration of the manganese in the digest, a flame atomic absorption spectrometer will be utilized.
For our preliminary test, the purpose of this test is to strengthen our hypothesis of the presence of heavy metals in the locality of Limay. So our presumed testing site is in Barriolus to perform the initial testing and determination of the concentration of nickel, copper, lead, and manganese which are prominent in the area based on the RRL. Thus, the resulting concentration will be compared to the limits of concentration exposure by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency or EPA and World Health Organization or WHO. So based on the resulting preliminary test, nickel has a sample concentration of 8.92 ppm, which is in the not polluted criteria of EPA and does not exceed the WHO limits. Meanwhile, for copper, it has a sample concentration of 30 ppm, which is in the moderately polluted criteria of EPA and also does not exceed the limits of WHO. As for the lead, it has a sample concentration of 4.62 ppm, which is not in the polluted criteria of EPA and also does not exceed the WHO limits. And lastly, for the manganese, it has a sample concentration of 640 ppm, which is in the heavily polluted criteria of EPA and also does not exceed the WHO limits. Thus, manganese concentration must be taken priority for monitoring since it possesses the risk of toxicity that exceeds the heavily polluted criteria by EPA.
To visually compare the sample metal concentration against the EPA and WHO heavy metal limits, a bar graph was used presented in Figure 4. The height of each bar represents the concentration of each heavy metal measured in parts per million or ppm. Nickel was not significantly present based on Figure 4. It did not surpass the EPA and WHO limits. This indicates that the sediments in the shoreline of Limay are not polluted with nickel. One of the metals that had been examined is copper. It was detected in the sample sediments from the shoreline of Limay that the copper concentration is 30 ppm. Following the EPA guidelines, it is moderately polluted with copper. For the WHO guidelines, it did not surpass the limit since the sample had 30 ppm. On the other hand, the preliminary test result for the concentration of lead is 4.62 ppm in the sediment sample. Based on the EPA and WHO guidelines for the lead, it did not exceed the allowable limit. Among the other heavy metals, only manganese had a high concentration. The manganese surpassed the limit of heavily polluted for EPA guidelines, and however it did not surpass the WHO limits.
After acquiring an analysis of data for the preliminary test, we immediately performed the collection of samples in Limay. As for the test results acquired in Barriolus, Table 2 presents the data of samples collected and the concentration of manganese on that particular date. As shown in the table, in August 6, it has a sample concentration of 595 ppm. In August 13, it has a sample concentration of 602 ppm. In August 20, it has a sample concentration of 534 ppm. In August 27, it has a 530 ppm of sample concentration. In September 5, it has a sample concentration of 600 ppm. And lastly, in September 10, it has a sample concentration of 578 ppm and having a average of sample concentration of 573.17 ppm, in which all the collected data are consistently in the heavily polluted criteria of EPA and also does not exceed the WHO limits.
Table 3 presents the test results in Barangay Lamao. This includes the date of sampling, sample metal concentration, EPA limits, and WHO limits. We also include the average of each section.
In this section, figure number 5 presents the graphical representation of sample metal concentration of manganese in their respective collection dates compared to EPA and Hu limits. The light blue line represents the sample concentration in Barilus. The dark blue line represents the sample concentration in Lamau. The orange line presents the EPA limits in reaching moderately polluted criteria. The gray line represents the EPA limits in reaching the heavily polluted criteria. And lastly, the yellow line represents the Hu limits. Thus, based on the observation of the graph, both sample concentration collected in Barilus and Lemao both consistently exceeds the heavily polluted criteria of EPA and also does not exceed the Hu limits. Furthermore, it is also observed that the sample concentration is also higher or also polluted in Lamau compared to Barilus. The study performed was an experimental approach to monitor the sediment condition and heavy metal concentration of manganese in the shorelines of Limay, particularly in the barangay Barilus and Lamao in a span of 2 months from the start of August until the end of September 2023. In the preliminary testing of presence of heavy metals in the shorelines, the presence of manganese exceeds the limits of acceptable concentration of Environmental Protection Agency only, or EPA, that can cause negative effects on the residents having a value of 640 ppm, compared to the other heavy metals such as nickel, copper, and lead. Furthermore, all samples collected were consistently determined to be exceeding the maximum limit of heavily polluted category of Environmental Protection Agency or EPA, but not for the World Health Organization or WHO. This expresses that the continuous contamination of shoreline must be continuously monitored and taken action due to its high values of manganese concentration in both Barilus and Lamau, especially in Lamau on the dates of September 5 and September 10, having an extreme value of 1088 ppm and 1075 ppm, which are already more than the double of the limits dictated by EPA. Thus, water treatment or cleanup actions must be upheld in these locations, especially in Lamau.
For our recommendation, we first recommended that other areas of the coastline can be considered for a more analysis of the existence of heavy metals. This is not restricted to the industries or the urbanized area around the Limay coastline. Second, future researchers should consider testing the pH level, nitrate, fluoride, algae, temperature, boron, ammonia, color, biochemical oxygen demand or BOD, sediment oxygen demand or SOD, and chemical oxygen demand or COD. And lastly, coliform count. Third, since we only focus on sediment samples, future researchers can include water analysis. Fourth, the entire duration of the study can be at least 3 months due to an increasing trend in manganese concentration. This might help future researchers better comprehend and explore the Limay coastline. And lastly, the impacts of heavy metals on marine life in the ocean may be studied since they may have significant consequences on bioaccumulation. That's all. Thank you for your attention. Again, I am Kate Liv J. Villegas, and my partner is Mark Aaron D. Garcia.